On the afternoon of Saturday, February 6th, 2010, 61-year-old Alain set up the ironing board behind the couch in the living room of a little house outside the town of Chartres in northern France. From the kitchen, he could smell the beef bourguignon simmering on the stove, but Alain and the 37-year-old woman who was cooking the beef bourguignon were not talking. The woman's name was Alexandra Nicola, and Alain had actually bought this house for her and her 10-year-old daughter. Alexandra used to be Alain's assistant, but over the years, they had developed a really close relationship that was much more like father to daughter. Now, Alexandra had not worked for Alain in a number of years, but, they remained close. And also, remember, Alain literally bought her this house. And so as a result of this bond they had, Alain found himself visiting her quite a bit at this house, helping out where he could, and he also paid for her car and also for their vacations. And Alain could afford to be this generous because he was a very successful, high-powered producer of circus shows, which were a huge moneymaker in France. Lots of companies booked circus shows for end-of-the-year parties for their employees, and Alain had lots of major contracts. And so as a result, Alain's office was in this fancy chateau in the countryside, and his wife actually lived in this luxury ski town near the Swiss border, and Alain was constantly traveling all over Europe for work. But this life could also be a grind. Just in the past 24 hours, Alain had traveled more than 1,200 miles, meeting with potential clients and scouting new performers. So he put a lot of value on the time where he could escape to Alexandra's house, where he could recharge in the quiet of the suburbs, and obviously spend time with somebody he cared a lot about. Now, Alain knew all of his friends and coworkers thought that he and Alexandra were blatantly having an affair here, and he was sure that's what his own wife assumed too. And this was fair, because after all, Alain did have lots of extramarital relationships. He also engaged with sex workers all the time, and he really didn't even try to hide any of it. He and his wife, Elizabeth, they lived in separate homes, and they sort of had this understanding that she can have this life, and he can have this life in exchange. However, Alain's relationship with Alexandra really was different. It had always been platonic. They'd never even kissed or held hands. Alain had no kids of his own, and he genuinely enjoyed playing the role of, doting father and grandfather to Alexandra and her daughter respectively. But now they were in this big fight, and Alain was anxious to repair it. Alexandra's daughter was out of the house for the weekend, so he and Alexandra had planned to have this nice dinner tonight before Alain had to head out again on business on Sunday afternoon. But Alain, somewhat stupidly, had brought up Alexandra's past, and they'd ended up getting into this horrible fight and just continued to yell at each other ever since. Alexandra was very defensive about her troubled history. When she was a young woman, she had moved to Paris and she had fallen in love and she had had a baby, but the baby had tragically died, and her relationship with her love had fallen apart, and so she had spiraled into very self-destructive behavior. By the time Alain finally met her in 2002, so this is 8 years before they were in this house having this big fight, Alexandra was really struggling. By this point, she had a 2-year-old daughter, and she was really struggling to provide for her because all she could muster in terms of work was like this combination of minimum wage jobs and side hustles. And so when Alain had hired her as his, full-time secretary, it had completely transformed her life. But, deep down, sometimes she seemed more resentful of Alain's power than grateful for his help. It's like he had total control over her well-being, and she didn't necessarily like that. And so with that as context, Alain left the ironing board and walked into the kitchen, hoping that Alexandra had cooled down enough that they could actually have a real conversation here. And so once he was in the kitchen, he sort of looked over at Alexandra and couldn't really tell where she was at, and then he turned, opened up the fridge, and just kind of stared inside of it, not really looking for any food or drink or anything. He was just hoping that Alexandra would say something to him. And to his relief, Alexandra did turn around and kind of playfully swung her dish towel at him, telling him that he had to wait for dinner. She didn't seem mad at him anymore, so Alain felt very relieved, and he smiled and closed the fridge, and then he told her to come sit with him and have some wine while they waited for the laundry to dry so she could iron it. A few minutes later, they both sat down on the sofa with their wine glasses, and Alexandra asked Alain how business was going. He told her it was good, which technically it was. His company was on track to bring in around 4 million euros that year, which is the equivalent of about 5 million US dollars. But despite how things looked on paper, Alain was pretty stressed. He made the majority of his money through contracts with companies, but he was not the only person competing for those lucrative contracts. His number one competitor was another circus owner whose name was Michel de la Rue. And recently, Michel had been beating Alain on one contract after another. And it was starting to feel to Alain like Michel was actually targeting Alain's contracts, trying to steal them from him, rather than trying to cultivate his own clients. Alain told Alexandra that on Monday, he had a very important meeting in Vichy, which is a city in central France about a 4-hour drive south of Alexandra's house. At this meeting, Alain was hoping to win a big contract, as long as Michel didn't steal it out from under him. Alexandra put her hand on Alain's arm and told him, "Don't worry." She said she was sure his meeting on Monday would be a huge success and they could celebrate in a few weeks on the ski trip that he had booked for the two of them and her daughter. Then she put down her now empty wine glass and went to go do the laundry. As Alexandra disappeared into the back of the house, Alain just kind of sat by himself for a minute. He was looking forward to the vacation that she had mentioned, in part because Alexandra had been a lot busier lately with her new boyfriend, a 42-year-old IT engineer from Paris named Yves Bernard. Now, Alain and Yves got along just fine, but he could tell that, Alexandra and Yves were getting pretty serious. They might even get married. And Alain couldn't help but worry that eventually, if that happened, Yves might start to resent him for sort of stepping in as this paternal figure in Alexandra's life, that perhaps he would come off as being sort of overbearing. But he was not going to let that fear wreck the evening. So as Alexandra came back now with the laundry, picked up a book from the coffee table, and took the last sip of his wine. The rest of the weekend passed by quickly, and by Sunday afternoon, Alain was back in his car, headed back out of town. But what no one would realize until much later was there was actually a second car following closely behind him. The following day, on the morning of Monday, February 8th, Alain Lelou's wife, Elizabeth, was drinking a coffee inside her home in the mountains when her phone rang. She picked it up and she heard the voice of Alain's assistant, Sylvie. And Sylvie sounded very worried. And she said she was calling to see if Elizabeth had heard from her husband recently. And this was pretty strange, because Alain was not the type of person to just disappear from work without telling his secretary. So Elizabeth told Sylvie that no, she hadn't heard from Alain in a few days. And then she asked Sylvie, why? What's going on here? And as Elizabeth listened to Sylvie's answer, she felt herself growing really nervous. Because apparently, Alain had this very important meeting in Vichy that morning, but he had not shown up for it. In fact, he'd never even checked into the hotel in Vichy where he was supposed to be staying. Sylvie said she had already reached out to several of Alain's friends and business contacts, but nobody had heard from him. And he was not answering the repeated phone calls to both of his cell phones, which appeared to be turned off. None of this made any sense to Elizabeth. Alain was famous for spending entire days on his various phones. She couldn't even recall a time when he'd been unreachable, even briefly. So Elizabeth told Sylvie she was glad she called, but she would take it from here. Then Elizabeth hung up the phone with Sylvie and called the police. Hey guys, I have some pretty big news. I know many of you are excited to hear. I am going to be doing another live storytelling tour this year. You can find me in a bunch of cities, including new ones on the West Coast and across the United States, where I have never played before. Plus, I'm really excited to share that I will also be performing in an international city, since so many of you have been asking me to visit. We put together an absolutely amazing show with a whole bunch of awesome stories, including stories you will not hear anywhere else. New content you can only get if you come to this show. And guess what? Tickets for this tour are available right now at tour.ballenstudios.com. In terms of the types of tickets you can buy, they range from general admission to VIP. Again, that's tour.ballenstudios.com. I'm also going to be giving away a trip to meet me at one of my live shows. And so if you want to enter for your chance to win that, all you have to do is donate to win at fandiem.com/Mrballen. Again, that's fandiem.com/Mrballen. Get your tickets and enter the sweepstakes today. I can't wait to see you at the show. A week and a half later, on February 19th, a young police officer knocked on the front door of a little house outside the town of Chartres in northern France. Now, up until this point, Alain's case had been treated as a simple missing persons case, with the local police in Alain's wife's hometown handling the inquiry, which was pretty basic. But now, enough time had passed without Alain being found and no evidence coming in, that the original report had been kicked over to the crime division because they were thinking this could potentially be a kidnapping or something worse. This young officer was here at this home because it was the last place Alain was known to be before he went missing. The door of the home opened, and a thin blonde woman looked out. The officer asked her if her name was Alexandra Nicola, and she said yes. When he explained to her why he was there, Alexandra looked immediately concerned and invited him inside. And as she led him into her living room and offered him a seat on her couch, the officer looked around, taking stock of the space. It was clean, but a bit cluttered, with toys that appeared to belong to a young girl scattered about. The officer scanned for any signs of a physical fight or violence of some kind, like damage to the walls or the furniture, but there was nothing that stood out, nothing concerning. Alexandra began asking the officer pretty anxiously all these questions about, what was going on with Alain. Was he hurt? Was he in some kind of danger? Like, what do you know? But the young officer just shook his head and said, for now, they really didn't know much. He was just here to try to build a timeline of Alain's last known movements. And so speaking of that, he asked Alexandra to please walk him through what she remembered about her last interaction with Alain. The officer took careful notes as Alexandra began to rattle off all the details she could remember. She said that Alain was like a surrogate father to her, and he had come over on the evening of Friday, February 5th. He had been there on Friday, also on Saturday and Sunday, and then he had taken off on that Sunday because he had to go to Vichy for this big meeting on Monday. She told the officer that after he left for that meeting, she hadn't heard from him, but that was pretty typical. She said their relationship was not remotely romantic, it really was platonic. And, he didn't always check in the way, a spouse would. This is more like really close friends. The officer nodded while he wrote down what she said. Alexandra seemed very helpful and appropriately worried, but he was suspicious of the idea that she and Alain were not romantically involved at all. So, before he left, he asked to see the rest of her house, in part just to see what her reaction would be. If she said no or got defensive, he would probe a bit more deeply. But she immediately agreed, and she actually took him all around the house, showing him anywhere he wanted to go. And what he found is the rest of the house seemed just as normal as the living room and the entryway. She eventually brought the officer back to the door and promised him she would call if Alain reached out. And so after leaving Alexandra's house, to be thorough, the officer actually went door to door up and down Alexandra's street, asking her neighbors what they remembered about that particular weekend and over the past several days, seeing if there was anything that contradicted what Alexandra had said. But everybody, more or less, confirmed Alexandra's story. Alain was indeed a regular visitor in the neighborhood, and several people did remember seeing him on the weekend in question and said that really nothing had seemed off. So eventually, the officer just left and went back to the station, and when he got there, he wrote a report highlighting Alain's last known destination of Vichy. Over the next week, police in Vichy, as well as in the ski town where Alain's wife lived, followed up on the loose threads of the investigation. They pored over Alain's cell phone history and his bank account and credit card transactions, which all showed no activity after he left Alexandra's house on February 7th. They also spoke to his business connections and his friends, but no one had heard anything. And they even put in a request to the car company Audi for the GPS data that was stored in Alain's car, which was an Audi Q7. Now, the investigators knew it was entirely possible that Alain had chosen to disappear. I mean, he was very wealthy, he had lots of connections. That was a possibility, that he had basically chosen to be gone. And if that was the case, it would be pretty difficult to find him. However, it was a lot harder to hide a car that logged all of its travel data. And so whether Alain's disappearance was voluntary, accidental, or the result of foul play, the police knew finding his Audi was likely the best hope they had of knowing where to even look for Alain. On February 26, 2010, so 19 days since Alain was reported missing, a detective named Pierre Martin stood in a secure impound lot in the city of Orléans, France, looking at Alain's gray Audi Q7. The GPS data that police had requested from Audi had come back a few days earlier, and it had led detectives to a surprising place. So again, the last place where Alain was known to have been before he vanished was leaving the home of his surrogate daughter, Alexandra Nicolas, near Chartres, France, and heading to Vichy, France for a business meeting. But his Audi had not been found in Chartres or Vichy. Instead, it had been discovered in the parking lot of a train station in Orléans, which was in between those two cities. And so to the police, it sort of looked like he had gotten halfway to his destination and just stopped. Now, when they found this car, the first thing they did is they just put it under surveillance for 2 days to see if maybe Alain or somebody else would return to it. For context, the parking lot where this car was in a pretty rough area where violent crime and sex work were pretty common. So, any number of people could potentially, break into this car or who knows what. It just seemed like a seedy area where something might happen here if we keep watching. But nobody had shown up. So finally, they just towed the car to the impound lot for forensic technicians to process it and look for evidence. And Detective Martin was here to watch that process. The forensic techs circled the vehicle and began taking photos of the outside and also dusting for fingerprints. There was no visible damage anywhere on the outside of the car, and there were no traces of any effort to try to break into the car. Plus, Alain's briefcase and luggage were clearly still inside the car, which meant, the fact the car was found where it was likely not a product of a robbery. This didn't seem like somebody just stole his car. It's here and it has nothing to do with Alain's disappearance. It seems like how this car got here is connected in some way to what happened to Alain. And, sort of going down that path, it seemed more and more likely that what happened to Alain probably fell into the category of foul play. However, when the technicians opened up the car doors and began dusting for prints inside, the upholstery was disappointingly clean, which doesn't exactly sort of enhance the idea that foul play happened here. It just sort of seems like what's going on. But after a few minutes, after, kind of thoroughly scanning the inside of the car, one of the techs pushed the button near the driver's side that opened up the trunk. And then after it was open, Detective Martin walked around to the back to look inside and see what was in there. And what he saw was this bulky object wrapped in a pink sheet. And right away, Martin had this sinking feeling in his chest as one of the techs reached forward with a gloved hand and pulled the sheet back. And pretty much immediately, Martin's suspicions were confirmed. Underneath that pink sheet was a body, a man's body, fully clothed and curled in the fetal position. There was no doubt this was Alain Lelou. But there was no visible blood or wounds or bruises anywhere on his body, and there was no blood in the trunk. When Detective Martin reached in to try to move Alain's body to further examine him, he found his body was already incredibly rigid with rigor mortis. The coroner told Martin that she would hopefully have some answers for him after she did the autopsy. The weather over the past few weeks had been pretty cold, which was good for evidence collection because it basically meant the trunk had sort of acted like a refrigerator and preserved Alain's soft tissue. As the coroner wheeled the body away, Martin just stood there staring at the now empty trunk. He had no theories about when or why or even how Alain had died. All he knew was that this was now officially a murder investigation. Detective Martin returned to his office at the police station and got to work. Since Alain's body was found in Orléans, he was now in charge of the murder investigation. His first step was to review all the witness statements and other evidence that had already been gathered by the other departments. And right away, the picture they painted told Martin that this was going to be a very complex investigation with lots of suspects and multiple locations. Alain was a workaholic who was always on the move, and he had no apparent connection to the city of Orléans, where he had ended up. In fact, he rarely seemed to spend more than a few days in the same place. He didn't live with his wife. Instead, he seemed to bounce between his office and a series of hotels, with stops at the home of a woman named Alexandra Nicola in between. According to reports, Alexandra had been interviewed, and she said that Alain was at her house the weekend before he disappeared. And so this made her the last person to see Alain alive, which, in Martin's mind, clearly made her a suspect right off the bat. However, Alexandra's story about Alain leaving her house on Sunday, February 6th, matched up with the data Martin had from Alain's car, cell phone, and credit card records, which all showed that Alain really did leave her house and went to Orléans on that day, and then, for reasons unknown, stopped communicating or spending money. Maybe that was the day he was killed. Right off the bat, like the police officer who originally visited Alexandra and took down her original story, Detective Martin found it pretty hard to believe that her relationship with Alain was not romantic. It just seemed like, based on how frequently they apparently saw each other and the fact that Alain was buying her things and, bought her house and paid for vacations and things like that, it just seemed like there was more to the story than what he had been told. But even though that did totally cast some level of suspicion on Alexandra, there was also just a logical side of it for Detective Martin, which is like, okay, the size difference between Alain and Alexandra was stark. I mean, Alain was 240 pounds, a really big guy, and Alexandra was just very small and petite. Now, is it impossible for her to kill him and put him in the trunk of the car in Orléans? No, but it just makes it sort of unlikely. And so that's just sort of floating in the background of Detective Martin's mind. But for now, what Martin found himself much more interested in was some of the other information that Alain's business associates and wife had supplied. First off, Alain apparently had lots of affairs with lots of women. And so that meant every one of those women, and any husbands or boyfriends or other romantic partners of any kind connected to them, were also suspects. It also meant that Alain's wife, Elizabeth, had a motive to want her husband dead. I mean, basically, he's cheating on her openly all the time. That's got to be motivation for her to do something to him. Now, Martin didn't think that Elizabeth literally would have done the killing herself, because she was actually 400 miles away at her home when her husband died. But she certainly had the financial means to hire a hitman. And the second thing that Detective Martin got from the associates and from Alain's wife was Alain's business dealings were both very high stakes and very ugly. Alain's employees and colleagues clearly respected him, but they also described him as a very tough boss and a ruthless business person. He could be very loud and abrasive, and he had already made his fair share of enemies in the circus business, which was already known to be a cutthroat industry where a lot of money was flying around. And so because Martin had been handed this murder investigation, and really there's like an overwhelming number of people that could have been involved here, instead of just, not being sure where to start, Martin just assembled a team of his very best deputies, and they set to work literally re-interviewing everybody, and from that, making a list of suspects that they deemed were appropriate. Three weeks later, on March 17th, Detective Martin walked into an interrogation room in the Orléans police station, and he sat down across from a relatively fit-looking 50-year-old man who was waiting for him quietly and apparently very calmly. The man's name was Michel de la Rue, and he was Alain's biggest rival in the circus business. He was also, at this very moment, Detective Martin's #1 suspect in this murder. Martin and his team had spent the last few weeks conducting dozens and dozens of interviews, and Michel's name had come up more times than anybody else's. And this was because, immediately after Alain disappeared, Michel had begun contacting Alain's clients, trying to get them to all sign new contracts with him, sort of a pretty cutthroat and cold thing to do. And Detective Martin had done the math on these contracts Michel was going for, and they added up to the equivalent of millions of dollars, which in the detective's mind was a very compelling motive for murder. Maybe Michel killed this guy specifically to gobble up these contracts. And not only that, but the coroner had by this point come back with Alain's cause of death. He had been strangled using some kind of ligature like a rope or a belt, and it likely took between 5 and maybe 10 minutes for Alain to actually be strangled to death. So the idea is someone's actively strangling him for that long. That is a long time to be right there on top of somebody killing someone. And then the scratches that were found on Alain's legs suggested that his body had been lifted into the trunk after he was already dead. So the death struggle, the actual strangling, clearly took place outside of the trunk. And so all that meant whoever killed Alain had to be pretty strong. And looking at Michel now, Detective Martin thought that he did fit the description. He seemed like a pretty fit, strong guy. However, as Martin began asking Michel questions and watching his face and body language for signs of anxiety or defensiveness that could suggest he was hiding something, what he found was Michel seemed pretty open and very straightforward, like he was not hiding a thing. Michel immediately acknowledged poaching Alain's clients, but he just shrugged as he explained it. That was business. He said he was sure if somehow the positions were reversed, Alain would do the same thing to him. And also, he said he had an airtight alibi. On the weekend, when the coroner believed Alain had been killed, Michel had been hundreds of miles away skiing. And then Michel produced this folder full of these receipts and all these phone numbers, and he handed it over to Martin, who took it, and he told Michel, okay, sit tight. And then the detective got up and he left the interrogation room and he handed over this folder to another detective to check out. But after that, Detective Martin did not go back into the interrogation room. Instead, he grabbed another detective and told them to take a shot. The idea was to sort of have a good cop, bad cop sort of dynamic to see if maybe that would rattle Michel. And so Detective Martin watched from behind the two-way mirror as the next detective walked inside and took a stab at, breaking Michel. But their conversation basically played out the same way that Martin's had. So Martin signaled for another detective to go in there and have them take a shot. But they too had a sort of run-of-the-mill conversation with Michel, and they didn't make any progress. And then finally, after basically hours of cycling different detectives into the room to try to catch Michel in a lie, Detective Martin felt a tap on his shoulder. And when he turned around, it was one of his deputies who told Martin that unfortunately he had called all the people that Michel had given them information for, all the witnesses from the ski resort, and he had also even called the manager of the ski lodge. And basically, Michel's alibi checked out. He clearly had not been physically able to kill Alain. He was at that ski resort at the time of the murder. At this point, Martin knew he could not just keep Michel indefinitely and just keep trying to catch him in a lie. Even if there was some possibility here that he was involved in this murder, at this point, there just wasn't enough evidence, and so he had to let Michel go. A few days later, Martin was back at his desk combing through reports when a uniformed officer came up and told him there was somebody at the front desk who really wanted to talk to him. And this was exactly the kind of news that Martin had been hoping for. He had recently put out a statement to the local papers basically saying, hey, if there are any witnesses out there, please come in and talk to me. And he hoped that whoever this was potentially a witness. And so Detective Martin followed the uniformed officer out to the lobby, and there he saw the person who had come in to see him. It was this man who appeared to be in his early 50s, who was dressed all in black with these shiny black shoes and glasses. And Martin wondered if maybe this was a business contact of Alain's. And as he went up to shake the man's hand, he sort of felt himself getting excited. But then this man introduced himself, and when he did, Martin had to resist the urge to just turn around and walk away right there. Because the man said his name was Remy Saint-Touren, and he was a professional psychic. Martin did not believe in psychics, and he was annoyed with the police officer for even bringing him out here to meet this person. And so Martin was literally about to just tell Remy to, thanks for coming in, but I don't have time for this, you need to go. But then he thought better of it, because Martin was really having no luck with this case. There had been very little forensic evidence recovered from Alain's car. There were no usable fingerprints, and while the bedsheet Alain's body was wrapped in did have some DNA on it, it didn't match anything in their system. And then the business leads that Martin had been pretty excited about hadn't panned out either, and he'd found no evidence that anyone in either Alain's personal or business circles took out a paid hit on him. Martin's team had also spoken at length to Alain's surrogate daughter Alexandra and all the women he was having affairs with and all the sex workers he had engaged with, and none of them, nor any of their boyfriends or husbands or partners, made sense as the killer. So, out of a mixture of a little curiosity and a lot of desperation, Martin brought Remy the psychic back to an interrogation room and asked him what he thought. Remy explained that he had heard a news bulletin about Alain while he was driving, and when he heard it, he had a vision that was so vivid that he actually had to pull over. He said he saw Alain Lelou as clear as day in this physical struggle with a woman. Remy didn't know her name, and he couldn't describe her, but he was certain that a woman was somehow involved in Alain's murder. Martin was disappointed because, unsurprisingly, this just sort of felt like a generic stab in the dark by somebody parading around as a psychic who could see things that nobody else could. It just seemed like he threw this random generic thing out there as if it was some big revelation, and it just didn't feel like it was. But Remy wasn't done. He went on to say he was sure that Alain was not killed in Orléans, even though that's where his body had been found. He said Alain's body had been taken away from the murder scene and actually placed in the trunk after he was dead. And this caught Martin's attention, because the coroner had been certain that Alain was strangled in one place and then placed into the trunk afterwards for transportation. But critically, the police had not released that information to the press, specifically because they wanted to be able to weed out fake tips. And so for Remy to say that, how would he have access to that? Now, Martin knew this could have just been a lucky guess by Remy, but it just seemed so, on the nose that he began considering what else Remy had said. This idea that, okay, Alain was struggling with this woman. That was something that, Martin had not really considered. He had sort of ruled most women out as the potential suspect because of how big Alain had been and how physical this murder had to have been. So it just seemed more likely that a big, strong man was responsible for the killing. But now, Martin wasn't so sure. And suddenly it seemed entirely possible that, maybe a woman really did do this. And so eventually, Detective Martin thanked Remy for coming in and sharing his ideas about the case. And then after walking him out of the station, Detective Martin sped back to his desk. Because Martin had an idea. Lots of people in Alain's life had told the police investigating his murder that Alain had had lots of extramarital affairs. Now, Detective Martin and his team had spoken to all the women they could possibly find who had had these affairs with Alain, and basically all of them had been ruled out. However, now, after talking with Remy the psychic, something about the location where Alain's body was found was jumping out at Detective Martin. The part of Orléans where Alain's car had been parked was pretty sketchy, it was crime-ridden, and critically, it was known for being a hotbed for sex work. Now, Martin already knew, clearly, that Alain engaged with sex workers. It just seemed like that was one of the things that he did, and they spoke to numerous sex workers and ruled them out as being suspects. And so for the most part, sex workers were not really on Detective Martin's radar as, primary suspect pool. However, now with fresh eyes, he was thinking, maybe the reason Alain was in Orléans was because he was there to meet a sex worker, and while he was there, something went wrong, and it resulted in his death. So, Detective Martin spent the next few days absolutely scouring Alain's laptop. Now, the forensic techs had already been through it once, looking at all of Alain's emails and business records, but Martin was looking at something different. He was using the laptop to search through all the websites where Alain had found sex workers to go visit. Basically, what he was doing is making a true exhaustive list of every single sex worker he had ever really engaged with. So this is an even bigger list than they had before. There were dozens of names and profiles to sift through, and as Martin found them, he would send members of his team out to speak to all the women he possibly could. But as he was doing this, Detective Martin discovered that really none of these sex workers that Alain was engaging with had any connection to Orléans, and they also did not appear to have any real issues with Alain himself, at least based on the messages that were on his laptop. However, as Detective Martin dug deeper and deeper into this laptop, going further and further back in time, he eventually came to one new profile. This woman named Marie-Eve. And when he took in who this woman was and got a picture of her and saw her information, he knew right then and there he had solved the case. Based on the entire police investigation as well as a confession from the killer, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Alain Leloup on the day he was murdered. The killer found themselves standing behind Alain, and inside they were burning with rage. Alain seemed to think he was so much better than the killer, just because he was this powerful businessman, and the killer was just a sex worker. And the killer had tolerated Alain's behavior because, Alain had money. But now, Alain had pushed it too far, and the killer felt like they had to shut him up for good. Alain's belt lay nearby, and impulsively, the killer grabbed it and lunged forward and looped the belt around Alain's throat. And at first, Alain struggled. He reached up, he's trying to pull the belt off, he has no idea what's happening, but the killer just held on tight. And for several minutes, there's this unbelievable death struggle going on, and Alain, he's fighting. He's a big guy, and he's getting close to pulling this thing off, but then something sort of unbelievable happened. The killer had sort of braced themselves against an object behind them, and so their back is up against it, and they're pulling as hard as they can with this belt against Alain's throat. And as they're leaning back, the object they're up against suddenly broke. And because, the killer didn't let go of the belt and is applying max pressure, when they fell backwards, it created almost like this whiplash effect. Their body tumbles, and all that force is driven into Alain's throat. And what happened is that sudden whiplash crushed Alain's larynx, and he immediately went still. And so just for good measure, the killer held on for a couple more minutes, pulling as tightly as they could across his throat, really ensuring that Alain was dead. And when Alain did not move at all, eventually the killer let go of the belt and stood up, their heart pounding, just sort of taking in the scene. Then, as reality began to set in for the killer, they realized they needed help getting rid of this body. This is a huge guy. How are they going to get rid of it on their own? So the killer called their accomplice. And the accomplice was hundreds of miles away in a ski resort, but they immediately told the killer to wait and they would drive to them. Sure enough, the next day, the accomplice arrived and they helped the killer load Alain's body into the trunk of Alain's car. Then the killer climbed into Alain's car and drove it to the train station in Orléans. Behind them, as they made this ride, police would realize much later there was a second car being driven by the killer's accomplice. The killer and the accomplice would abandon Alain's car and his body in Orléans, and then together they would drive away, and shortly thereafter, they would actually get married. Because the killer was Alain's own surrogate daughter, Alexandra Nicolas. Alexandra's troubled past that she was very defensive about included the fact that she was actually a sex worker under the name Marie-Eve. Her accomplice was her new boyfriend, Yves Bernard. So Alexandra and Alain had fought previously about her, troubled history, and she was especially mad that at one point, Alain had implied that Alexandra's daughter could sort of end up like her, as if that would be a horrible thing. So on Saturday, February 6th, when Alain brought up Alexandra's daughter, just sort of in conversation, For Alexandra, something snapped. It just felt so disrespectful that he, again, was talking about her daughter. And sort of out of impulse, she grabbed the belt, wrapped it around Alain's neck, strangled him, and ultimately stumbled backwards and crushed his larynx and killed him. In a way, it was sort of true what Alexandra had told the police when they initially questioned her, that Alain had left her house in his car on February 7th, and she had not seen him again. What she had left out was that Alain was already dead in the trunk of his car when he left. Alexandra Nicola confessed to the murder of Alain Lelou and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Her boyfriend, Yves Bernard, was sentenced to 2 years for concealment of a dead body. The couple has since been released, and together they have a child who was born before Alexandra went to prison. Early in the morning on February 5th, 1990, 57-year-old Laverne Pavlinok stood in the kitchen of her Wilsonville, Oregon apartment making some coffee. Mornings were the best part of Laverne's day because she had the whole apartment to herself. Now, she lived with her boyfriend, John Sosnovsky, but he worked at a nearby mill and had to be out early in order to catch the bus there. And each time he left, Laverne felt like a huge weight lifted off of her. Because when John wasn't home, Laverne could go about her day and pretend she was safe. But that's all it was pretend. John, in reality, was an incredibly violent man. I mean, he was seriously physically abusive, especially when he was drunk, which was basically all the time. So Laverne had actually been married, but her husband had died of cancer, and she had ultimately met John following her husband's death. And so when they met, Laverne was very vulnerable and lonely, and she really hadn't realized the kind of person John was until it was too late. It had been 10 years now, and Laverne still had not, built up the courage to leave him. I mean, the reality was she was just scared of how he would react, and so she sort of felt trapped. Now, she sat down at her kitchen table with her coffee, and she opened up the local paper. And as soon as she did, the first thing she saw was a big black and white photo of a smiling young woman who likely was in her 20s. The photo was connected to an article about a recent murder that happened 30 miles away, just northeast of Portland. The victim had been identified as a woman named Tanya Bennett, and Tanya Bennett was the girl in the photo. The article said she had been beaten and then also strangled with a rope, and then she had been left on the side of the highway. And when Laverne read about the area she actually had been, dumped, she realized it actually was only about 1.5 miles down from this famous scenic overlook that Laverne had actually been to before. Like, she was familiar with this area. And so Laverne, she's reading the article and she's looking at this picture back and forth, and it was like something was sort of forming in her mind. She just had like this weird sense that she knew something about this case. And then as she stared at this photo for a little bit longer, it's like it all came together. And she realized almost certainly that she knew John very likely killed this woman. And so even though she loved her peaceful, quiet mornings with her coffee, Laverne immediately stood up, she grabbed the phone, and she called the police. After she hung up with police, Laverne was very shaken up. I mean, her heart was still racing. I mean, this was a very risky thing she was doing, because she had no way of knowing if what she had just given authorities was enough to arrest John. If it wasn't, it was entirely possible that John would discover this betrayal of her calling the police about him, implicating him in a murder, and he would probably just continue his abuse, if not amp up his abuse of Laverne. And so the way she saw it is either what she just did was going to end the chapter with John and he was going to go to jail for murder, or Laverne might wind up being the next dead girl on the side of the highway. A little over a week later, on the morning of February 16th, Detective John Ingram sat with his partner in a very clean living room in Wilsonville, Oregon. Ingram was the lead investigator on Tanya Bennett's murder case, and he was there to speak to Laverne, who was sitting on the opposite couch. And Laverne seemed really nervous and kept fidgeting constantly and offering Ingram and his partner refreshments. It was just very clear that there was a lot on this woman's mind. So Ingram knew that Laverne had a week earlier called in a tip about the victim's killer. She thought it was her own boyfriend, John Sosnovsky. And right now, Ingram was very eager to hear what she had to say about her boyfriend, to basically elaborate and sort of give the full story of why she believed what she believed, in part because Ingram's case so far had absolutely no other leads. Like, this was it. The victim's body had been found on a grassy slope so close to the edge of the highway that you could see her from the road. But Ingram and his partner had not been able to find any witnesses. A few people had claimed to have seen Tanya along with some man at a bar earlier in the night before she went missing, but no one had been able to effectively describe that man. It was just some guy she was with. And so Ingram and his partner had basically talked to just about anyone they could think of that might have known Tanya. They'd canvassed her neighborhood, they'd interviewed her family, coworkers, friends, and they still had not been able to find anybody who fit as a suspect. They also hadn't found any good physical evidence at the scene, like fingerprints or helpful forensics. So now Ingram was hoping that Laverne was going to be the key to his whole case. And so eventually Ingram looked at Laverne and said, "Whenever you're ready, tell me what you know. Tell me the story of why you believe John killed Tanya." Now, at first, Laverne just continued to squirm in her seat, and she was, obviously very nervous, but eventually, after Ingram told her to just, take a breath, calm down, it's okay, we just want to hear your story, eventually, with a shaking voice, she told them that on the night of the murder, John had come home around maybe 1 or 2 in the morning and immediately got in the shower. Now, this was unusual. I mean, this is not something that he typically did. He didn't shower at 2 in the morning, but Laverne really hadn't thought much of it until the next day when they went to a local bar, and she'd literally overheard John bragging to somebody about murdering Tanya, describing how he had picked her up at a truck stop, killed her, then took her to the highway by Columbia River Gorge to dump her body by this scenic overlook. As Laverne spoke, Ingram and his partner were shocked. Basically, Laverne had overheard effectively a confession, and the details of that confession did seem to line up with what they had heard so far. Tanya had been seen out late at night with some man, although nobody could really describe the man. And also where her body was found, it was near the scenic overlook, something that was, publicly known, but still, that's what Laverne heard John say. It lined up. But he kept a poker face and just told Laverne to please keep going, keep elaborating. And so Laverne, she continued speaking, and she went on to say that the reason she didn't come forward right away was because she was scared of John. He was a violent alcoholic who abused her, which is also part of the reason why this seemed real to her. She was totally not shocked at the idea that maybe John killed someone, but she was basically fearful that he might kill her too. And so she had kept it to herself until she had seen the article in the paper and also saw the picture of the girl, and she just looked so young and innocent, and she just couldn't help but feel like she owed it to that girl to come forward. Now, at this point, Ingram's mind was whirling. If this was all true, it was huge for this case. Potentially, this just solved the whole murder. This is what happened potentially. But he also knew, right now, it was just one woman's story. He needed actual proof. He couldn't just take Laverne's word for it. So he asked Laverne if he and his partner could just go ahead and search the apartment. And as soon as Laverne nodded, the detectives jumped to their feet and got to work. Laverne led the detectives down the hallway to the master bedroom, and then from there, she backed off and just, let the men get to work. And the detectives, they immediately split up and spread out to cover more ground. Ingram had actually brought along a list of stuff that they were theoretically looking for. And one of the things on his list was a swatch of denim from the front buttons of Tanya's jeans. It had been missing when they found her, like it had been intentionally cut out, which was obviously pretty unusual. And it made him think that Tanya's killer had taken a trophy or something. But after a few minutes of searching around the bedroom, Ingram did not see this denim patch. In fact, he actually didn't see anything at first glance that connected John to Tanya, until he went over to look through this cardboard box of papers and began sifting through them. And when he pulled out a torn piece of scrap paper and read what was on it, he froze. On this piece of scrap paper was a handwritten message that just said, quote, "T. Bennett, good piece." Ingram immediately called his partner over, who walked over and looked at the note, and both of them are like, okay, obviously, we need to bring John in right away for a chat. But after leaving the bedroom and walking towards the door to leave, who comes in the front door? None other than John Sosnowski. Hey guys, I have some pretty big news. I know many of you are excited to hear. I am going to be doing another live storytelling tour this year. You can find me in a bunch of cities, including new ones on the West Coast and across the United States, where I have never played before. Plus, I'm really excited to share that I will also be performing in an international city, since so many of you have been asking me to visit. We put together an absolutely amazing show with a whole bunch of awesome stories, including stories you will not hear anywhere else. New content you can only get if you come to this show. And guess what? Tickets for this tour are available right now at tour.ballenstudios.com. In terms of the types of tickets you can buy, they range from general admission to VIP. Again, that's tour.ballenstudios.com. I'm also going to be giving away a trip to meet me at one of my live shows. And so if you want to enter for your chance to win that, all you have to do is donate to win at fandiem.com/Mrballen. Again, that's fandiem.com/Mrballen. Get your tickets and enter the sweepstakes today. I can't wait to see you at the show. About an hour later, Ingram sat at an interrogation table in the sheriff's office, staring across it at John. And John had a very confused look on his face, but otherwise seemed relatively calm. Back at the apartment, when John had walked in the door and sort of saw the detectives and didn't know what was going on, Ingram had told him who he was and why he was there. And John had really just seemed surprised, but had quickly agreed to go with them to the station if they wanted to speak to him. But Ingram knew from experience that, just because John was acting very cooperative did not mean he was innocent. Now, Ingram slid a picture of Tanya across the table and asked John if he knew who she was or had anything to do with her murder. And John didn't deny it or act horrified or offended to be asked. He just said he didn't really remember. And when Ingram showed him the note they found in his bedroom that said T. Bennett, good peace on it, John just sort of squinted at it and said he really wasn't sure if he wrote that or not. So these were all very straightforward questions, and it was highly suspicious to Ingram that John apparently just couldn't answer them, at least not cleanly. And really the rest of his interview went the same way, with John giving mostly just vague non-answers to everything Ingram asked, no matter how binary the question was supposed to be. And Ingram was just sort of struck by how nonchalant John seemed whenever he responded, even though, he was being questioned about his connection to a murder. This was not a time to be nonchalant. This was a time to be forthcoming. However, despite Ingram's very high suspicion of John, realistically, the only evidence he had on John, at least at this point, was all circumstantial, and so was not nearly enough to actually arrest John. What they needed in order to do that was some form of hard evidence that directly connected him to Tanya's murder. So ultimately, at the end of this interview, despite how weird the whole thing had been, Ingram just sighed and told John that for now, he could go. 4 days later, Ingram had just gotten to his office for the morning when his desk phone rang. He picked up and was surprised to hear Laverne's voice on the other end. But before he could ask her what this was about, Laverne told him she had found something in her car that morning and felt like he needed to see it. And when she told him what this thing was, Ingram said he would be right over. Then he immediately hung up and ran to find his partner. As he drove to Laverne's, he found his heart was racing. Over the last few days, they hadn't found any additional evidence to prove John was their killer. In fact, if anything, they had actually lost some evidence, since that note they found inside of John's things in his house ended up being a dead end, because their analysts couldn't actually match the handwriting to John, so they didn't know for sure if it was him. But now, based on what Laverne had just told him on the phone about what she found in her car, he was pretty much positive that this was the break he needed. Within the hour, Ingram and his partner were standing in Laverne's garage with Laverne staring into the open trunk of her car. Laverne had told Ingram that she kept her car and really her whole life very, very clean, like her apartment's clean, everything's clean all the time. And when she went into her car that day, she noticed there was a little swatch of denim sitting in the trunk. And she knew that she had not put it there, and considering she was sort of on high alert about John and about his connection to this murder, it just seemed like something worth flagging to police. And for Ingram and his partner, as they're staring into the trunk at this little swatch of denim, that looks very much like the swatch of denim they were secretly looking for. They had not publicly revealed that the killer had taken a little swatch of denim from Tanya's jeans. That was private. They're looking at this thinking, oh my goodness, like this is the break we needed. Clearly, that's the denim from Tanya's jeans. And so Laverne was right to call this in. This is potentially huge. Now, obviously, Ingram knew that they would still have to get this denim tested to make sure it really was Tanya's. I mean, it's entirely possible that it was actually Laverne's or John's or was unrelated, but circumstantially, this felt like hitting the jackpot. And so Ingram watched as his partner picked up the swatch, put it into an evidence bag, and then they left and said they would have it tested and they would be in touch. The following morning, Ingram was at his desk reviewing all the evidence that they had so far. And by this point, they had a lot of evidence. The previous night, after finding the denim, they had brought John in for a polygraph test, and he had completely failed it. The test administrator had even noted that, in his opinion, John definitely knew what had happened to Tanya. So now, realistically, Ingram was just sort of waiting on confirmation that that fabric was a match. And then at that point, they could go and arrest John. And when Ingram's phone rang, he picked it up immediately, and it was the lab. And so Ingram sat up straight, ready for some good news, but the tech on the other line sounded sort of glum, and he told Ingram that the denim from Laverne's car did not match the jeans that Tanya was wearing, so it was not hers. And at this, Ingram was just completely stunned. I mean, the idea that they had just found the same unique cut of denim in a car in their main suspect's house could not be a coincidence. I mean, it was not typical for people to have little swatches of denim lying around. Like, this is not something that you just happen to have. It felt sort of specific. And so there just had to be more to this than met the eye. And even though Ingram tried to work out some kind of reasonable explanation for why that swatch was there, the only thing that actually made sense was that the fake denim was planted there. And so feeling a mix of, again, shock, but also just frustration here. I mean, he thought he was so close to solving this thing, and now he was sort of back to square one. Ingram realized that the next stop had to be Laverne's. He needed to go speak to her again. Later that morning, Ingram and his partner were once again back in Laverne's living room with a very nervous-looking Laverne sitting across from them. This time, Ingram was going to be a little tougher on her, because he now knew that, whatever she had told him before very likely was not the full story. And as soon as Ingram asked Laverne point blank if she had planted that evidence, that denim inside of her car, Laverne just kind of looked back at him and her face began to sort of quiver, and then she just started sobbing. And she told him she was so sorry. She explained that she had cut up some jeans and put that front button part in her car and pretended to have found it so that they'd be able to arrest John. She said she had just gotten so worried when they let him go after interviewing him because she knew John killed Tanya. He had to have. She heard him talk about it. Like, he did it and he's dangerous. And she just wanted to make sure the police held him accountable. Now, when Ingram heard this, he could hear the earnestness in her voice. Like, clearly this woman is scared of John and thinks he did this. She believes he did this. And so he wanted to believe her angle here, as inappropriate as planting evidence was. But, critically, he knew Laverne still was definitely not telling him everything, because there was simply no way she could have known to plant that unique cut of the jeans unless she had intimate knowledge of the crime or some other inside information. But there was just something missing here. Why would she randomly choose that front cut of denim as just the evidence? Oh, here's some evidence that's going to make John look guilty. Why would she choose that? That's way too on the nose. And when he pointed this out to Laverne, it was like Laverne's energy completely shifted, from sobbing and sadness and remorse to just pure hesitation. Like, she didn't really know how to react, but there wasn't any more sadness. It was like, uh-oh, something's off here. And then Laverne kind of took a deep breath and she looked at Ingram and she said, I was lying. You're right. My story about planting the evidence, that was a lie. But she went on to say that the reason she had lied was because she had ultimately been too afraid that if the police knew the whole story, that she would get in trouble too. Then Laverne explained what really happened to Tanya. On the night that Tanya was murdered, Laverne said John called her that night and he was sort of frantic. And he said to her that he was in trouble and that she needed to meet him at the bar that he was at. and to bring along a shower curtain. And so Laverne said because she was very scared of John and, was just fearful of asking any questions, she had just done what he said. And she got the shower curtain and she had driven out there and she found John in a parking lot standing over a body. It was Tanya. And she was just lying there on the ground, motionless. Laverne said she was horrified and didn't know what to do, so she just helped. She literally helped John put Tanya's body into her car, Laverne's car, wrapped her up in that curtain she'd brought along, and then together they dumped her body at a spot along the highway. But as Laverne continued to talk, her story suddenly got much darker because she actually eventually confessed that actually Tanya had not been dead when she had first arrived, but instead she was still clinging to life. And at John's request, Laverne had tied rope around Tanya's neck and held it tight while John sexually assaulted her. Laverne said after he was done, Tanya was no longer breathing. Ingram could barely conceal his shock when she explained this. I mean, here was this gentle, soft-spoken lady who was now telling him that she had actively participated in the sexual assault and murder of this young woman. It was hard to wrap his head around it. And at the moment, all Ingram could think was, this can't be real. But what Laverne was saying just fit. It explained John's cagey answers to his questions, his failed polygraph, and how Laverne knew the right part of the genes to cut out and fake his evidence. Because she and John had been the ones who actually made the cut on Tanya's genes. They knew. But despite getting this earth-shattering confession here, Ingram wanted to be completely sure that this version of the story Laverne was telling him was actually the truth. And he knew exactly how to prove it. The following day, Ingram was behind the wheel of his cruiser next to his partner, and Laverne sat in the back, sort of absent-mindedly staring out the window. They were driving down the highway northeast of Portland, and Ingram had instructed Laverne to let him know when they reached the spot where they dumped Tanya's body. Now, the newspapers had published the general location of where the body had been found, but certainly not specifics. So Ingram knew that if Laverne could point out the exact spot, well, that meant she was telling the truth. As they began to get closer and closer to the spot Ingram knew was the spot, he sort of felt his heart rate pick up, but he didn't drive any faster or slower. He didn't signal that it was coming up. He just kept on driving, steady, going straight, sort of expecting Laverne to call it out any moment. But the cruiser drove right past the actual spot where the body had been found, and Laverne didn't say anything. For a few minutes, they just kept on driving down the road in total silence, and Ingram's feeling really disappointed here. And as they're driving along, suddenly Laverne says, "Hey, wait a minute, turn around." So Ingram did, and soon they were headed back the way they'd come. And this time, when they passed the actual crime scene, so the actual spot where Tanya had been found, Laverne called it out and said that's where she was. Stop. As Ingram parked the car, he looked back at Laverne, who was staring intently out the window, right at the exact spot on that slope right off the highway where the body had been found. Then, once they were parked, all three of them got out of the car, and Laverne went over to the edge of the road and pointed, like right to the exact spot where Tanya had been found on the slope. And even though Ingram tried to keep his expression neutral here, internally he was sort of amazed. I mean, clearly Laverne was telling the truth. It would have been impossible for her to have chosen that specific spot without having prior knowledge of where Tanya had been, meaning she was telling the truth. She must have been involved in killing Tanya. As they all climbed back into the car, Ingram knew they now had more than enough to formally arrest John and also Laverne. She'd done the right thing by coming forward, but of course now there were going to be consequences. On February 21st, so 16 days after Laverne called with her first tip, John Sosnovsky was arrested. And 5 days after that, Laverne was arrested as well, and both of them were charged with murder. About 11 months later, Laverne's trial started, and at that point, Laverne actually tried to change her story again. She tried to recant her confession and said, "No, I didn't actually do this." But the jury didn't buy her change of heart and convicted her of murder, and she was sentenced to life in prison. As for John, 2 months after Laverne's sentencing, he was given the same sentence, life in prison. And that should have been the end of the case, at least from the legal perspective. But for the next 3 years following sentencing, Ingram just couldn't stop thinking about Laverne and John and Tanya Bennett. Despite what Laverne had done, he felt a lot of empathy for her. She'd obviously been under John's control and had seemed genuinely terrified of him. But more than that, Ingram had this horrible, nagging feeling that they'd gotten something wrong here. Then, one March afternoon in 1994, Ingram was in his office at the sheriff's department going over some paperwork when his desk phone rang. When he picked it up, it was the prosecutor who'd worked Tanya's case. And the prosecutor said they'd just gotten a very strange letter about Tanya's murder. And as soon as the prosecutor described the letter's contents, Ingram felt sick to his stomach. Ingram had been right to worry that he and his partner and really the whole legal system had potentially just gotten something wrong with this case. It just felt like there was something left unsaid. There was some loophole, there was some loose end something, but he didn't know what it was. It would turn out the thing that was wrong was Laverne, because their star witness, Laverne, was not just this sweet older lady afraid of her abusive boyfriend who had come forward and told the truth despite the consequences. That wasn't really the story. In fact, basically everything she told Ingram and his partner was a lie. What was true, and what ultimately drove Laverne to do what she did, was she really wanted to break up with John, but she didn't know how to do it. And so what she ultimately did to attempt to rid herself of John was to frame him for murder. And at first, she did an incredible job. She read everything she could, little details about the murder in the news. She also snuck a peek at Ingram's list of evidence during that early interview that was done at her apartment. And so that's how she knew about, that swatch of denim they were looking for. And she also just happened to take a few really lucky guesses. Like when she pointed out the spot on the side of the highway where the body was found, she just guessed, but it happened to be right. However, the problem was, despite, basically nailing the framing of John and getting him wrapped up with a murder conviction, she also sort of inadvertently implicated herself. When she came out and said, well, I participated in the murder, her thinking was, they'll take pity on me and they'll blame John, he'll go to jail and I'll be okay. But no, she also got convicted of murder and went to jail as well. And Laverne and John were literally in prison, basically riding out their life sentences, when the actual killer, the real Tanya Bennett killer, sent a letter to authorities confessing to his crime. That was why that prosecutor called Ingram. It was to tell him, I think there's been a mistake. They clearly didn't do it. After the real killer was arrested in 1995, Laverne and John were both released from prison. In total, they both served 4 years in jail, all because of Laverne's lies. One morning in early November of 2023, a 71-year-old woman named Patri Miller stood in front of her fridge in her little home in the rural town of Downeyville, California, and she saw she was running low on food, which meant it was time to place an order with the market in town, which delivered her groceries for her. Getting her food delivered was essential for Patrice and where she was at in her life right now. She lived alone and had a whole house to take care of, which was definitely getting harder the older she got. She'd also had some health problems lately, so it was getting more difficult just to move around. She even had a walking stick just to prop herself up. As Patrice stood in front of her fridge, wondering what she was going to add to her grocery list, she heard one of her 2 cats meowing outside. And this reminded her that amongst some other chores, she needed to feed her cats. So she decided to make her list later, and she just closed the fridge door, put some cat food in a bowl, and then grabbed her walking stick and headed outside. Patrice carried the cat food out onto the porch. She had some other things to do outside, but she couldn't hold a lot of things at once because of her walking stick. So once she had put the bowl down, she then headed back inside to get her compost, and then took that back outside to her garden. And she tried to do all these outdoor chores really quickly because she didn't like being outside these days. She had lived in Downeyville for a long time, but over the past few years, it had gotten really dangerous there. Now, she hadn't realized how bad it was at first because she mostly kept to herself, but eventually she learned that her neighbors were starting to get intruders on their property. There had also been a clear uptick in vandalism in people's yards and to their homes. And in fact, over the past few months, Patrice herself had begun to experience this directly. In fact, she had dealt with so many attempted break-ins at her own house that she had become convinced that she had a stalker. She'd even put bars on her windows as a security measure. So that's why Patrice did not like being outside. She felt exposed, like her stalker or whoever it was that was doing this was going to be watching her and would come over here and attack. And so, as fast as she could, she dumped the compost in her garden, turned around, hustled inside, and shut the door behind her. And as soon as she had done that and was safely inside her house, she felt hugely relieved. A few days later, on November 8th, at the market in town where Patrice typically got her groceries, a 55-year-old cashier named Cassie Koch rang up a customer at the register. But as she bagged their purchases, her mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about Patrice. Cassie was typically the person that delivered Patrice's grocery order, but over the years, they had become closer than just a customer-provider relationship. They were friends. In fact, these days, the two of them would speak on the phone fairly often, just to chat. But now, Cassie realized she hadn't heard from Patrice in days, which was very odd, both because of their friendship, but also because she knew it had been a while since Patrice made her grocery order. And so Cassie had begun asking around at the store and had found out that nobody else had heard from Patrice either. Now, Cassie knew it was possible that Patrice was just busy, and for pretty much anybody else, one missed order or even a couple missed orders wouldn't be enough to make Cassie worry. But in this case, Cassie was extra concerned because she knew about Patrice's stalker. And she knew that Patrice had even called the authorities about it, but there really hadn't been much help. Remember, this is a tiny rural town in California that had experienced a lot of exactly what Patrice was experiencing: break-ins, harassment, and other kinds of vandalism or damage. However, neither Patrice nor anybody else had reported any actual violence. So authorities were basically overwhelmed with a flood of what they considered sort of relatively minor complaints. And Patrice's situation really didn't seem much worse than anybody else's in town. And also, officials just didn't have the manpower to deal with it. And so ultimately, all authorities did was just advise Patrice on ways she could handle it herself, which was why she'd installed those bars on her windows. All this is to say, Cassie knew that Patrice was genuinely terrified of her stalker, who Patrice referred to as Big Bastard. And she was worried about what the stalker might do next. So after Cassie was done with her shift that day, she tried to get in touch with Patrice one more time. But when she couldn't reach her yet again, Cassie called the police and asked them to go do a wellness check. That evening, a deputy from the Sierra County Sheriff's Department drove up to Patrice's house and parked in front. And immediately, he could tell something was wrong. The front door of her house was clearly smashed in, and there was a garden hose that was laying across her porch steps and was spraying water everywhere, like the water had just been left on. And so the deputy got out of his cruiser and he walked over to the house and he found the turnoff for the water on the side of the house. And then he walked up the front steps of the porch. And as he did this, he was constantly looking around and listening, trying to figure out what was going on here. I mean, he didn't know if there was an active threat inside the house. He had no idea what he was walking into. And so he's on the porch, and before going in through the front door, which was obviously, smashed open, he looked in a window to see if he could see into the house to gauge what was going on here. And when he looked inside the house, the first thing he saw was blood all over the floor. And at that point, he unholstered his gun. And so now, with his gun raised, the deputy stepped into the house. And he slowly walked through the living room, listening for any signs of sudden movement or an indication there was someone still in the house, but he didn't hear anything. And so there didn't appear to be an intruder present right now, but there was also no sign of Patrice. All he saw was that blood towards the front of the house. That was it. And so the deputy, he left the living room and walked towards the kitchen. And as soon as he stepped across the threshold into the kitchen, he breathed in and just kind of held his breath because what he saw was just chaos. All the cabinets were open. And all over the floor were remnants of all the food that likely was in the cabinets, like pieces of food and ripped up packaging and broken jars. A window at the far end of the room was also smashed, and the security bars that Patrice had put on the window were bent and hanging by their hinges. There was actually so much just debris and just chaos in the kitchen that at first, the deputy didn't register what was actually laying in the center of the kitchen on the floor. But then, when his brain sort of processed it, he realized what he was looking at was Patrice. At least, what was left of her. But she no longer looked human, because her body had literally been torn apart. The deputy quickly left the house and called in his terrible discovery to the sheriff, and within an hour, Patrice's property was swarming with police and crime scene techs and a forensic expert who specialized in this type of scene, and detectives fanned out all across the area and began speaking to Patrice's neighbors. And because pretty much everyone in the neighborhood had been experiencing the same type of break-ins and property damage that Patrice had been, it actually didn't take long for police to develop a profile of Patrice's killer. Their conclusion was that very likely the killer was the same individual who was harassing everybody else. But what officials couldn't understand is, why had everybody else experienced effectively minor vandalism, but Patrice went from minor vandalism to really excessive violence? And this required developing a profile of Patrice. And so as police searched for her killer, they were also working on reconstructing Patrice's movements on the final day of her life. And at first, in their efforts, really they were just stumped. I mean, all she had done on that day, as far as they could tell, were some basic chores. But as they dug into what those chores consisted of, they found two things that actually explained everything. It would turn out that every day for the past couple of years, Patrice had been making two terrible mistakes. She fed her cats out on the porch, and she emptied her compost into the garden. And these two actions ultimately were what sort of attracted her stalker, Big Bastard, to her home. Because Big Bastard was a black bear. He loved to eat cat food and kitchen compost scraps. And eventually, he decided that Patrice was food too. So on that day in early November of 2023, when Patrice fed her cats and emptied her compost for the last time, Big Bastard waited until Patrice was in bed and then broke into her house and savagely killed her. By the time the deputy arrived at Patrice's home, Big Bastard had been eating Patrice's body for days, and so what he saw in the kitchen was what was left of her. Black bears are not typically dangerous to people. In fact, Patrice was the first known black bear fatality in California history. But it was exactly that sort of lack of perceived danger, which is why officials didn't help Patrice or any of her other neighbors get rid of these black bears when they were coming into their neighborhood and causing all this property damage and all this alarm. They basically said, what's the worst they could do? At 4:30 p.m. on June 23, 2014, 49-year-old Patri Iswar hurried out the side door of a hospital in Set, France, buttoning a fresh-collared shirt as he ran to the parking lot. He climbed onto his scooter and then quickly checked his watch, and then he lifted the kickstand and sped off into traffic, ignoring honks from all the other drivers as he swerved between the cars. Patri did not care who he was annoying right now, because he was running late for a date, and then right after the date, he had to rush over to his daughter's dance recital. And he desperately wanted to make sure he made both of these events, because they were some of the only things he'd had to look forward to in ages. So things in Patrick's life had not been good for a really long time. 8 years earlier, he had slipped into a rut of serious binge drinking and gambling. And one day, when he was drunk, he had actually struck his wife. Following that, his wife had divorced him, and he'd lost custody of his daughter, Alabama, who was now 12 years old. After that, Patrick's life really did not get any better. He had moved in with his elderly mother, and his drinking had only gotten worse, and his gambling continued to the point where he basically gambled away most of what he made by working as a hospital janitor. And then after that, he'd gotten involved with a married coworker, and then when her husband found out about this affair, she died of an apparent suicide. Her death had been 5 years earlier, and it had been so traumatic that Patri had barely dated since. He had just about resigned himself to a life of bachelorhood, when actually a few weeks earlier, he had gotten a call from the woman he was now going to meet, Audrey LeVay. But Patri was now running so late for his date that he worried Audrey might not wait around for him. So he twisted the throttle of his scooter and shot across an intersection, ignoring more honks from more cars. Patri had actually met Audrey a long time ago, right after his divorce, and they'd gone out a handful of times before they ultimately lost touch. She was a lot younger than he was, and she'd stood him up more than once in the past. But she was also a lot of fun, and it had been a while since Patri had been on a date, so when she called him up saying she wanted to go out again, Patri had said sure. They'd made plans to meet this afternoon at a park near Patrick's work that had this big rocky hill rising behind it. And the place had some of the best views in the whole city, with the ocean on one side and dramatic cliffs dotted with all these old caves on the other. Now, they were not going to have a whole lot of time together, probably just enough for a short walk before Patrick would have to rush off for his daughter's dance recital later that night. But he hoped that the romantic setting might help spark something between them again. A few minutes later, Patrick pulled up to the park entrance, and to his relief, Audrey was still there waiting for him. So he parked his scooter and locked his cell phone in the scooter's underseat compartment, and he walked over to her. And from her nervous smile, he got the sense that she was almost as excited about the date as he was, which gave him a nice boost of confidence. So he took her hand, and they started down the path. Around 8 a.m. the next morning, 10 miles up the coastline from where Patrick and Audrey had been walking at that park, Patrick's older brother, Mark Iswar, stood on the deck of his boat, pulling a big oyster trap out of the water. As he was doing this, his phone rang, so he stopped and he answered it. But before he could even say hello, his mother's very worried voice came across the line, asking if he knew where Patrick was. Mark frowned because Patrick lived with their mother, so she should know better than he would. But his mother explained that Patrick hadn't come home last night. He also wasn't answering his phone, he hadn't shown up to work that morning, and perhaps most concerning of all, he'd missed his daughter's dance recital the previous evening. And it was this last fact that made Mark think that something might actually be wrong here, because he knew how much Patrick loved his daughter and how much he was looking forward to that recital. So he promised his mother he would get to the bottom of it, then he hung up and began calling Patrick's friends. However, with each conversation he had, Mark got more worried, because nobody had heard from Patrick since yesterday afternoon. He'd apparently left work around 4 p.m., but he hadn't told anybody where he was going. Now for Mark, he felt like this was at least somewhere to start. Patrick's work. So he steered his boat to the dock, tied it off, and then jumped in his car and started heading that direction. 4 hours later, Mark stood on a rocky lookout point scanning the city below. Patrick's hospital stood in the middle of Set's business district, which was packed with canals and cafes and tourist spots, and Mark and a handful of Patrick's friends had spent all morning checking them one by one, looking for Patrick. But they hadn't found him or any sign of him. And so now Mark had turned his focus to some of the more remote areas around the city, like the hill behind the park where he now stood. But there was still no sign of Patrick anywhere. And so Mark was trying to think of anywhere else his brother might have gone when his phone rang. It was one of Patrick's friends from the search party, and he just found Patrick's scooter outside the park at the bottom of the hill, just a short drive from where Mark was. And so Mark told him not to touch anything, and he sprinted back to his car, and he sped down the hill, and he left the park, and he stopped in the parking lot right outside. And sure enough, there in the lot was Patrick's scooter. And as Mark looked at the scooter and at the quiet park all around him, he felt a cold weight settle in his stomach, because he really couldn't think of any reason why Patrick would leave his scooter here overnight. In the back of his mind, all day, Mark had been worried that something bad could have happened to his little brother. But now, after seeing this scooter, he felt sure of it. Almost 2 weeks later, at 8 a.m. on July 5th, 2014, Detective Boris Ferrier took the exit ramp toward the French town of Set. And as the sunlight hit his windshield, he had to squint as he looked out at the long stretch of beaches and canals framed by these beautiful rocky cliffs in a small, dense urban center. Verrier was a senior investigator from the nearby city of Montpellier, but he had just been called in to take over a missing persons case that had stumped the local police in Set. About 2 weeks earlier, 49-year-old Patrick Iswar had disappeared after going on a date with a woman whose name was Audrey Louvet. The local police had already spoken to Audrey, who said she didn't know what had happened to Patrick. She said they had gone for a walk, and then he had escorted her to her bus, and then after that, she'd assumed that Patrick just sort of went back to his scooter and carried on with his night. But the scooter had been found the next day, still parked, where he and Audrey had met up for their date, with no sign of Patrick anywhere nearby. And now, almost 2 weeks later, Patrick had still not turned up. Since then, Patrick's brother, Mark, had been helping the investigation. Verrier had spoken to Mark on the phone, and Mark had talked about Patrick like he was a saint, a guy who would drop everything to help out somebody in a jam, who never got into fights and had really no enemies. But Verrier didn't necessarily believe this, because in his experience, people who inexplicably vanished oftentimes were kidnapped or murdered. Now, he had no reason to actually suspect that around Patrick. He could have just as easily gotten into an accident, fallen off a cliff, or maybe he chose to vanish. But at this point, what Verrier really needed to do was, on his own, dig into who Patrick was and figure out if there was a reason why he wasn't here right now. Do you want a treat that's both refreshing and indulgent? Well, My Mochi ice cream is creamy, premium ice cream wrapped in sweet, chewy dough that is absolutely satisfying and joyfully chill. My Mochi comes in delicious flavors like strawberry, mango, and cookies and cream. The strawberry is made with real fruit and tastes like biting into the perfect strawberry at peak summer. It's the perfect balance of chewy and creamy and fruity and cozy. But my favorite flavor is for sure cookies and cream. It's dreamy, creamy, and the cookie bits keep it fun. I take them out of the freezer and I let them soften up just a little bit, and then I can't stop eating them. My Mochi is also gluten-free and only around 70 calories per piece. It comes in a box with 6 individual snacks, which makes it really easy to share. That is, if you want to. Look for the purple box of My Mochi ice cream in the freezer aisle of your local grocery store. A few minutes later, Verrier followed Patrick's ex-wife, whose name was Claude Ozize, into her living room, and they both sat down. Verrier switched on his recording device, and he asked Claude where she was on the day Patrick went missing. Claude said it was just an ordinary Monday for her, and that after work she had picked up their daughter, Alabama, from school and driven her to her dance recital. She had expected to meet Patrick there at the recital, and it really surprised her when he didn't show up, because even though Patrick had plenty of flaws, he was a good dad. And at that, Verrier sort of leaned forward, because Patrick's flaws were actually what he wanted to know about. Now, he didn't think Claude was guilty of anything here, since she had a pretty strong alibi and didn't really stand to benefit from Patrick's disappearance. But he hoped she could maybe tell him about any old habits or current habits that could have gotten Patrick into trouble. And so when he asked her about this, Claude hesitated before saying she really didn't want to badmouth Patrick. But he drank and gambled a lot more than he should. At this point, Verrier pressed her for more details, but Claude just insisted that Patrick had really always kept that part of his life away from her. But after she thought about it for a moment, she said there was someone who might be able to tell Verrier more. And then she called their 12-year-old daughter, Alabama, into the room. Alabama appeared very visibly nervous and shaken up by everything going on with her dad, but her mother, Claude, took her hand and encouraged her to share her story. And slowly, the girl began to speak. She said that about a week before her dad disappeared, he'd brought her along on a very strange errand. They'd parked outside of a tunnel, and he'd told her to wait in the car. And then he got out and walked into this tunnel to meet with someone. It was a man. But it was too dark in the tunnel for Alabama to make out the man's features, but she definitely saw her father, Patrick, hand this man some kind of package before he quickly turned and ran back to the car. And then afterwards, her father wouldn't tell her who this man was. He just said that he'd done something really stupid, and because of it, he now owed some people a lot of money. After Alabama finished talking, her mother, Claude, thanked her and sent her back out of the room. And then once she was gone, Verrier asked Claude if she knew who this man in the tunnel might be. But Claude said she had no idea. But she said she did have one name that was worth looking into. Now, this was not someone who would have lent Patrick any money, but instead, it was a man who held a personal grudge against him. His name was Remy Shen, and he was a local hairstylist. An hour later, Verrier sat in a cramped cubicle of the Set police station, scrolling through a file on his laptop. Based on Claude's tip, he'd looked up the hairstylist's name in the police database and had immediately found a connection to Patrick. Back in 2009, so a few years after Patrick's divorce, Patrick had been questioned as a witness in the suicide of Remy Shen's wife, a woman named Nadège Shen, who had worked with Patrick at the hospital. Apparently, Nadège had come home after a work party and confessed to Remy that she'd been having this affair with Patrick. The couple argued for hours about it, and Nadège ended up sleeping on the couch while Remy went upstairs to their bedroom. and then the next day, Remy found Nadege in their garage hanging by the neck. As soon as Verrier was done reading this, he knew he finally had a suspect, and so he looked up Remy's last known address and contact information. At around 10 a.m. the next day, so July 7th, Verrier followed Remy Chen into an interrogation room at the Sète police station and shut the door behind them. Remy was a short, wiry man with a very obvious scowl on his face that made it clear he thought he was being very inconvenienced here. Verrier immediately got the feeling that Remy would likely only crack under intense pressure. So right away, he tried to shake Remy by saying they knew he was involved in the kidnapping of Patri Guizoir. Now, this was a total bluff because Verrier did not actually have any evidence, but he wanted to see how Remy would react. And to his surprise and irritation, Remy just laughed. Remy acted like he literally had no idea who Verrier was even talking about. And when Verrier brought up his late wife and sort of insinuated that obviously Patrick had had an affair and was a witness when she had died, Remy just scoffed and reminded him that it had been 5 years since her passing. He said he had moved on and begun dating other people. And anyways, it was sort of absurd to think that he would hold a grudge for 5 years without doing anything, but then suddenly now decide to take some sort of revenge out of the blue. It just didn't add up. But Verrier didn't really know what to make of this. It seemed like Remy was really confident, almost too confident. And so he pivoted and just asked Remy where he was on June 23rd, the day Patrick went missing. And after thinking for a moment, Remy just said that he had spent the whole afternoon alone cleaning out a storage unit that he had rented. This was obviously not a great alibi at all, but at this point Verrier had no choice but to let Remy go. As Verrier watched Remy leave, he knew he was running out of time here. 2 weeks had already passed since Patrick's disappearance, and every day the odds of finding him alive got worse. So out of desperation, Verrier decided to circle back to the very start and speak again to Audrey Louvet. Being the last person to see Patrick before he went missing, Audrey was an obvious person of interest, but Verrier wasn't sure what more he could learn from her. The local police had already questioned her at the very beginning of the investigation, and Verrier had already watched that interview tape a number of times. But Verrier knew he just had to take a shot, so he picked up the phone and he called Audrey into the station. Later that same afternoon, around 2 p.m., Verrier sat across from Audrey in the same room where he just interviewed Remy. He said hello to her and he started the recorder, and then he asked her to explain her history with Patrick again. And at first, her answers were all just like they'd been on the tape. She said they had met 8 years ago in 2006, and they'd dated casually for a while before losing contact. And then, just a few weeks ago, she happened to pass the bar where they first met, and it made her think of Patrick. So she'd called him up out of the blue to ask how he was doing, and they'd ultimately made plans to see each other again. She described their date as being a short walk around the park, after which Patrick had walked her to the bus stop and then headed off, presumably to go back to his scooter and to head off to his daughter's dance recital. And that's when Verrier interrupted, and he asked Audrey to tell him specifically which direction Patrick had headed off after dropping her off at the bus stop. And Audrey sat there for a minute, and then she said, I can't remember. And this really bothered Verrier, because here was this person who should be able to tell him the most about Patrick's last moves, and she had basically nothing useful to offer the investigation. So Verrier just sort of dropped the polite tone and really went after her. He told her he wasn't buying her act and that she needed to tell him everything she knew right now, or this was all going to get much, much worse for her. Audrey's eyes went wide and her voice began to shake as she insisted that she'd already told them everything. But Verrier didn't let up. He kept demanding that she just admit what she'd done until he was practically shouting at her. And Audrey was in tears and she was repeating over and over that Patrick had been fine when she left him. She just didn't remember all the details. And finally, Verrier backed off. He'd run countless interrogations throughout his career, and his gut was starting to tell him that Audrey's fragility was not really an act here. He'd pushed her as hard as he could, and he had to admit that maybe she was just telling the truth. A little while later, after Audrey was gone, Verrier sat alone inside the interrogation room thinking about the case. He hadn't managed to rule out any suspects yet, and he still had no idea who that mysterious man in the tunnel might be. And on top of all that, there was still the possibility that no crime had been committed here since they had no body. Who knows what really happened to Patrick at this point? And Verrier knew that there were just too many unknowns, And Verrier knew that if the case was ever going to gain real traction, they needed to find Patri, dead or alive. Around 11 a.m. on July 17th, so 3.5 weeks after Patri Isouard disappeared, Detective Boris Verrier parked along the shoulder of a winding roadside in the French town of Sète. He got out of his car, he stooped beneath a strip of yellow police tape, and he headed across the long strip of dry grass leading up to a sheer cliff wall. A dozen yards ahead of him, barely visible in the rock face, was the dark, round opening of a cave. A few hours earlier, a group of teenagers had shown up at the police station seeming very frazzled, saying they had found a human body inside of that cave. And as soon as Verrier had heard about this, he had rushed to the scene because the cave was less than a half a mile away from where Patrick's scooter had been abandoned. And so now, Verrier turned on his flashlight and he stepped into the cave. And as soon as he did, a forensics team fell into step right behind him, and together, they began making their way into the darkness. Thanks to his flashlight, Verrier could see that the walls were covered in graffiti and that there were empty bottles and other garbage everywhere. So it seemed like this was probably a popular party spot for young people. As they moved deeper, the cave split off into a maze of all these different narrow tunnels. And just as Verrier was about to direct his team to spread out and begin searching all of them, he passed by one of these tunnels that absolutely reeked. And so Verrier stopped what he was doing and just aimed his flashlight down this particular tunnel. And he saw there was a shallow pit dug into the floor. And lying at the bottom of this pit was what looked like a ragged lump of black fabric, until Verrier stepped closer. The smell was overpowering now, and Verrier knew he was standing over the charred remains of a human body. Verrier bent down to examine it, and he saw right away there was what appeared to be a bullet hole in the skull and a bullet hole to the torso. And those details, one to the head, one to the stomach, and then, the body being burnt afterwards, likely to get rid of evidence, felt very familiar to Verrier. It felt like this could have been a mob hit. A year and a half later, so just before Christmas of 2015, Detective Verrier was in his office in Montpellier when his phone rang. It was Patrick's older brother, Marc, calling to ask for updates on his brother's case, again. And Verrier sighed because the truth was, he had nothing new to report. The body in the cave had been confirmed to be Patri, and so Verrier had hoped that discovery would lead to all these new leads. But after scouring the cave for clues and testing the cigarettes from the scene for DNA and speaking to the teenagers who reported the body, the case just hit a dead end. Now, the mob-like execution style did line up with a theory that Verrier had that, maybe Patri had been killed over a gambling debt, by the mob basically, or someone who was affiliated with, organized crime. But Verrier had never been able to actually uncover any trace of Patri having any sort of debt that would get him killed. Also, he still had not been able to identify that mysterious man in the tunnel that Patrick's daughter had mentioned. And so that left Remy and also Audrey as his only suspects. And Verrier had placed both of them under surveillance, but so far, neither of them had done anything suspicious. So the investigation was now stuck, and Verrier understood that Patrick's family was really out of patience here. So he was not surprised that when he admitted he still was not ready to make an arrest, Marc snapped. He told Verrier that if the police weren't capable of solving this, he was going to take matters into his own hands. 3 months later, on a night in March of 2016, Detective Verrier sat down on his couch in his living room to watch something that he'd been warned was coming. Marc had convinced the producers of a national true crime TV show to do an episode on his brother's case, and the episode was airing tonight. And as the show started, Verrier felt a knot of anxiety, because Marc knew details about the investigation that were not meant for the public, and if he shared them on this show, it could seriously compromise the case. But obviously, Verrier was also just curious to see how the episode had turned out, and part of him hoped that maybe renewed public attention might actually help the case. And as Verrier watched the show, he was relieved to see that Marc wasn't there to talk about case specifics. He was there to talk about Patri. Marc described his brother as this hardworking father who never seemed to catch a break in life, and who at the very least deserved justice. And at the end, he put out a simple plea for anyone with information to please come forward. When the show ended, Verrier did not really feel worried anymore that anything that had been revealed on the show was sensitive or that it could negatively impact the actual investigation. But he also knew that, the impact the show was going to have was probably going to be pretty small. Like, he didn't expect anything to come of this plea for help from the public. However, he would be wrong, because the next morning, Verrier's phone would ring. And an hour after that call came in, Verrier was ringing the doorbell of an apartment building in Lunel, which is a town close to Sète. A woman would answer the door, and when Verrier flashed his badge, she invited him inside. The woman, whose name was Sophie, had reached out to the police after watching Mark's interview on TV, saying she did have information about Patrick's case. And so Verrier followed her into her kitchen, and he sat down across the table from her, and he turned on his recorder, and he told her to just start from the beginning. And the moment the story began to spell out, Verrier knew he'd solved the case. Based on the evidence collected at the crime scene and witness testimony, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Patrick Isouard on the afternoon of Monday, June 23, 2014. At 4:30 p.m., the killer stood on a rocky hill overlooking a park in Sète, watching through a pair of binoculars while Patrick and Audrey walked hand in hand down a paved path below. The couple was taking their time, clearly enjoying the scenery and each other's company, and then at some point, Audrey stopped and pointed across the road at a cave in the nearby cliffs, the entrance to a cave. And when the killer saw this, their heart began to race, and they watched intently as the couple actually crossed the road and went into the cave and vanished. At this point, the killer lowered their binoculars and put them inside of the large duffel bag they had brought with them. Then, after slinging this bag, they hustled down the hill and went right to the entrance of the cave. When they reached the entrance to the cave, they stopped, and they put that bag on the ground. They unzipped it, and out of it they pulled a large rifle, a roll of duct tape, and also a white mask. The killer put the mask on, and with the rifle and tape in hand, they entered the cave. And they could hear the sound of Patrick and Audrey inside. They had not gone far, and they clearly had not clocked the killer coming in. They were sort of wrapped up in their date. However, when the killer got close enough, the couple heard their footsteps, and they turned around. When Audrey saw the killer in their mask with the gun, she began to scream, and Patrick, he just went white as a ghost. Before the couple could even react, the killer threw the duct tape at Audrey and told her that if she wanted to live, she would do exactly as instructed. Then the killer told Audrey to use this tape and bind Patrick's wrists and ankles. And at first, Audrey just stood there in stunned silence, but eventually she composed herself and she obeyed. And as she was binding Patrick just also stood there in stunned silence, not really sure what to even do. When Audrey was done, the killer told her to leave the cave and to not say anything about what had happened to her. She hesitated just long enough to glance back at Patrick, but then she turned and she ran. Once her footsteps had faded and it was just the killer and Patrick inside of this cave, Patrick just stared, wondering what was going to happen to him, and the killer, after making really intense eye contact with Patrick, raised his rifle and shot Patrick in the head and also once in the chest, and Patrick crumpled to the ground. At that point, the killer slung his rifle, and then he grabbed Patrick by the ankles and he dragged his body down a nearby tunnel and dumped him in that shallow pit. Then the killer doused the body with lighter fluid from a canister they'd brought in that bag. They lit a match and tossed it in. As Patrick's body began to burn, the killer walked out of the cave and pulled off their mask as soon as they stepped into the light. They now had only one thing left to do: go find Audrey and explain everything, and convince her not to go to the police. Because the killer was Remy Chen, the hairstylist who hated Patrick for having an affair with his late wife, and he had just successfully tricked Audrey into helping him pull this murder off. It would turn out Audrey was actually Remy's ex-girlfriend. They had met and begun dating in 2009, shortly after the death of Remy's wife. And Remy had realized that because of Audrey's history with Patrick, because they had also dated, he could use her to lure Patrick into a trap and finally take his revenge. But even though Audrey was clearly a key part of this plan, she didn't actually know that Remy was going to kill Patrick. Remy had told her a sob story about Patrick owing him a lot of money, and she thought they were just going to scare him into paying up. It was not until she got into the cave and Remy showed up with a mask on and a rifle that she realized he had something way more sinister in his mind. After the murder, Remy convinced Audrey to stay silent by threatening to kill her and her children. And for over a year, she kept it secret, lying to the police the whole time. But when she watched that true crime episode about the case and saw Mark's plea for information, she finally just cracked and confessed to her friend Sophie, who was watching the show with her, who then went on to call the police the very next day. On March 31st, 2016, Remy Chen and Audrey Louvet were arrested for their roles in Patrick's death. Remy received 30 years in prison for murder, and Audrey was sentenced to 12 years for acting as an accessory to the kidnapping. One night in April of 1919, a middle-aged man named Eric Marth woke up in his bedroom in the city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, because his entire bed was shaking. He saw his wife, Margaret, was lying next to him and she was thrashing around and gasping for air. But Eric didn't panic because he knew exactly what was happening. So Eric and Margaret had moved into this house just a few weeks ago, but pretty much right away after moving in, Margaret had begun having these very intense nightmares that would wake her up almost violently, like what was happening right now. Now, from Eric's perspective, these nightmares she was having looked horrifying, but there really was not any physical risk to Margaret. I mean, she would just have these horrible visceral dreams and kind of shake around, but that was it. And so, like he had been doing the past couple of weeks, Eric just reached over and gently put his hands on his wife's shoulders and began repeating her name very gently over and over again to try to kind of get her out of this trance she was in. And sure enough, a moment later, Margaret, who kind of stopped flailing, she let out this huge gasp, and then she sat up straight and panted for air, and she turned to her husband and she said, "I saw the ghost again." And when Eric heard this, he wasn't like, "Oh my goodness, there's a ghost." Instead, he was just kind of annoyed. And so he did his best to comfort her, but he's just thinking, what in the world is going on here? So a few years ago, Margaret had joined the spiritualism movement, which was a very popular religious movement at the time. And spiritualists thought they could contact the dead. Now, Eric absolutely did not believe in ghosts, and he was pretty sure that Margaret's staunch belief in spiritualism was now effectively causing these nightmares. That it was not the house, it was just her belief system. It was kind of manifesting in these nightmares. However, Margaret felt the opposite. She felt like it was the house itself that was haunted. And it was haunted by a vengeful spirit that attacked her every night in these dreams. Now, Eric, it's the middle of the night, he's tired, he's annoyed. He didn't feel like discussing whatever she believed about this ghost right now. So after she said, "I saw the ghost, I saw the spirit again," he just told her to, calm down, go back to sleep. But on this night, Margaret didn't lie down. She actually turned to Eric and she said, "No, I have to figure out what's going on. I have to figure out who this ghost is and why they're haunting me." A week later, a very resigned Eric sat at his kitchen table next to Margaret, and across from them sat a medium, which is a person who spiritualists believed could talk directly to the dead by conducting a ritual called a seance. The medium began to light some candles, and as they did, they told Eric and Margaret to close their eyes because she was ready to begin the seance, where she would ask the spirit haunting their house what it wanted, and they needed, silence and their eyes closed to do that. So Eric fully believed that this seance would be a waste of time and money. He didn't believe in this stuff at all. But he knew his wife did, and it meant a lot to her. And so he's thinking, maybe this can help my wife sleep through the night again. And so Margaret and Eric did as they were told. And Eric, he closed his eyes and he listened as the medium began clearly rocking back and forth in her chair and began sort of dramatically calling out to the ghost and telling him to reveal himself. And at first, nothing happened, which was exactly what Eric had expected. But after a minute, Margaret suddenly jumped up from the table and ran out of the kitchen across the living room. And Eric, not knowing any better, just got up and followed her. And Margaret, she ran down the hallway and she threw open a door that led down to their cellar and she raced down the steps. Now, Eric was doing his best not to ridicule what was happening here and just to play along. But it's like, what is his wife doing? What's happening here? And so as he's chasing after his wife, he starts saying like, "Honey, what's going on here? Where are you going? What is this?" But she didn't respond. It was like she was on a mission. And then finally, when Eric got down the steps and he's in the cellar,
he saw his wife, who was now standing in the middle of the cellar with her arms out wide. And slowly, she began to point to a spot on the floor. And in this really weird and hollow voice with this sort of vacant expression on her face, she told Eric to dig. Now at this point, Eric was totally freaked out. Not because he believed that the seance had worked or that there was a ghost here, but because his wife genuinely was acting totally bizarre. I mean, she was acting possessed. And even if that was an act, it was a terrifying one. And so he just said no. There was no way he was just gonna start digging up the cellar floor. Like, what is going on here? But then the medium came rushing down the stairs as well. And they said that Margaret was in a trance, that the ghost in this house was channeling her, and that basically Eric had to do whatever the ghost said. Suddenly, Margaret's voice cut across the room again, and she said to Eric to dig up the floor. And this time she was more forceful and almost desperate, like, you must do this. And so Eric, he's looking at his wife, he's looking at the medium, like, what in the world is happening here? But he's like, you know what? I don't know what's happening. I'm just gonna dig. I'm gonna do what they tell me to. And so he grabbed a shovel and just began digging up the cellar. And after just a few minutes, Eric's shovel hit something in the ground, something hard. He thought it was just maybe like a big rock or something, but a few minutes later, after he and the medium and also Margaret, who's now come over at this point, they'd kind of cleared off whatever it was, they saw in the ground, what had previously been covered by the earth, was this rotten wooden box. And so he and Margaret and the medium, they pulled it out of the hole and they opened up the lid, and all three of them immediately recoiled, because inside of the box was a human skeleton. And so after a minute of just, again, stunned silence, Eric just looked up at Margaret, who did not seem shocked by what she was looking at. This was like confirmation in some ways. And he says to Margaret, is this the skeleton of the ghost that's been haunting you? And Margaret, with that same hollow voice, like it wasn't her voice, looked at Eric and just said, no. It would turn out, according to the story that has been passed down about whatever happened in this house, that the ghost was a doctor who used to live in the house that Eric and Margaret moved into. And 18 years earlier, this doctor had performed an illegal surgery on a young woman, and this woman had died during this procedure. But again, because this surgery had been illegal, the doctor knew if word of what happened here got out, he would be arrested. So what did he do? He dismembered the girl's body and shoved it into this wooden box, filled the box with quicklime, and then he buried it in his basement. And amazingly, the doctor never got caught for what he did. And so he basically spent the rest of his life feeling very ashamed and guilty. And then finally, when he did die, it was like his spirit couldn't actually rest until he confessed. And so this haunting was basically to get Margaret to go down into the basement and see what he had done. Everyday life is full of moments that you plan for, and also moments that just happen, often when you least expect them. Whether it's part of your normal routine or something unexpected, Amazon is where you go for everyday essentials, making shopping simple and dependable. From running out of household basics to last-minute surprises, Amazon's great deals and low prices on everyday essentials make it easier to handle whatever life throws your way. Everything is in one place, so there's no extra stress or jumping through hoops when time is already tight. Whether it's something you buy regularly or something you suddenly realize you need right now, Amazon makes it easy to find what you're looking for quickly and at a price that feels good. It's straightforward, dependable shopping that makes everyday moments feel more manageable with less stress, fewer steps, and more confidence that your money is well spent. Shop Amazon and save on essentials. Save the everyday. One afternoon in April of 1925, a wealthy teenager named Lacey raced his horse around the huge estate where he lived in eastern Hungary and took in all the land that he knew he would inherit someday. He stopped when he reached the gardens on the far side of the estate, but before he could ride his horse into the gardens as he wanted to, a field worker ran up to Lacey and asked him to stop and turn around. The field worker, who was about Lacey's age, explained that Lacey was not allowed to ride his horse through the garden anymore because the last time he had rode through some flower beds And Lacey's father was really mad about it. And at this, Lacey felt totally exasperated because he was tired of his father always bossing him around. And it embarrassed him to be reminded of this by someone as low class as a field worker. So Lacey's family was part of the noble class. His dad was a baron and his mother was a baroness, and they lived together in an old castle on this beautiful estate. And for the most part, Lacey loved his noble life, but his father could be harsh and really controlling. And sometimes Lacey dreamed of the day that he would inherit his dad's title, because then he, Lacey, would be in charge of the estate and he could finally run things the way he wanted. And so Lacey decided he wanted to show his father and this field worker and the other field workers that they couldn't order him around all the time. And so he rode his horse right into the gardens and intentionally rode all over their prized flower beds. Lacey's plan was to head back home and go into the castle and talk to his father about that field worker's rudeness. But when Lacey got back to the castle, he didn't have a chance to even speak to his father, because that whole day his dad was very busy with estate matters. And then that night, his father died of a heart attack. A week after his father's death, Lacey walked through the crowded banquet hall in his family's castle looking for his mother, because he wanted to make sure that she was okay. He and his mom had just gotten home from his dad's funeral, and now they were hosting a reception for everyone who had attended. But Lacey couldn't find his mother anywhere inside of this banquet hall. And with a sinking feeling, he realized there was only one place she could be. So after Lacey's father had died, his mother had gone a little bit crazy. She refused to believe that her husband had died of a heart attack, and instead kept insisting that he had been murdered. More specifically, she thought he had been scared to death, because when she had seen his body for the first time, his facial expression looked horrified, like he was actually scared as he died. Now, the doctor had explained to her that it was entirely possible that his heart attack came on suddenly and he was scared about what was happening to him, and so, was scared when he died. But the Baroness wouldn't listen. She said this was intentional. Somebody did this to him. And so ever since, she had basically spent all of her time in Lacey's father's bedroom searching for clues about her husband's supposed killer. So now, Lacey left the banquet hall and climbed the stairs up the castle up to his father's bedroom. And just as he suspected, when he knocked on the door, his mom answered, looking totally frantic. Lacey told her to come downstairs and say hello to their guests, but she said no, that she was too busy looking for evidence. Then, before Lacey could say anything, his mom just shut the door in his face. The next 6 months went by basically the same way. Lacey's mother spent all her time locked up in the Baron's bedroom around the clock, and Lacey spent most of his time riding his horse, including in the garden, because he didn't like going home anymore. His mother was now technically in charge of the family estate, but she had really let things go since her husband had died. She basically had not taken up any of the responsibilities that she was now in charge of. And so at this point, Lacey really couldn't wait until he was on his own and in charge of the castle and the estate himself. One night in mid-October, so this is at the 6-month mark from when Lacey's father had died, Lacey ate dinner alone, which was common at this point since his mom basically still refused to come downstairs at all. And then after he ate dinner, Lacey began making his way upstairs to get ready for bed. And as he walked upstairs, Lacey just felt overcome with anger and desperation and just kind of general angst about the current situation. He longed so desperately to just be alone and in charge of the estate. He hated the current setup with his mother in charge, but not really doing anything. I mean, the whole estate was just falling apart here. But eventually, despite feeling kind of riled up, Lacey, got into bed and closed his eyes and did eventually begin to drift off to sleep. But right after he had fallen asleep, he was suddenly awoken by this ear-piercing scream that was echoing down the hallway. And he realized it was his mother, and she was screaming for help. And so Lacey jumped out of bed and he raced down the hallway to his father's bedroom. And as he ran, other servants were flooding the hallway, racing towards the room as well. And Lacey, he got to the door, he unlocked it, and he rushed inside. And when he got in there, he saw his mother pointing at the foot of the Baron's bed. And she was saying that a demon had appeared in the bedroom and had loomed over her like it wanted to kill her. And so she told Lacey that the demon had to be what scared his father to death. The demon was the murderer. Lacey's mother looked absolutely convinced here. But Lacey, and really all the servants as well, just kind of collectively sighed, because there was obviously no demon at the foot of the bed here. And his mom clearly had just had a bad dream, or, was just basically acting crazy. And so as the servants kind of, went back to their rooms to allow the family to deal with this, Lacey told his mother to just go back to sleep here. And then he turned and walked back down to his room feeling completely defeated, because to Lacey, his mom was basically losing her mind here, and he had no idea how he was going to help, or really how much longer this current setup was going to last. But this was awful. On both of the next 2 nights, Lacey woke up yet again to the sound of his mother screaming about a demon inside of the Baron's bedroom. And so by the 3rd morning, Lacey had just had enough. He decided he was going to force his mother out of that bedroom and insist that she come downstairs and eat breakfast with him and just act normal for once. However, when he walked to the Baron's bedroom and knocked on the door to speak to his mother, it was not his mom who answered. It was a police detective. Lacey was stunned, and he walked into the bedroom and saw his mother, who was standing there with 2 more detectives. And Lacey asked, what's going on here? Lacey's mother explained that she had called the police to help her catch the demon that was haunting her at night and very likely was responsible for killing her husband. And at this point, Lacey thought he might die of embarrassment. This was unbelievable that now the police were involved. But instead of talking about that, he just begged his mother to please send the police home. They do not need to be here. But his mother refused. She was fully committed to the idea that there was a demon here and the police were going to help her find it. And the police, to be honest, looked like they didn't really know what was going on. They were just kind of trying to figure out if this was serious or not, or if there was some sort of intruder, but they were just kind of like, we'll see. And so Lacey finally just turned, left, hopped on his horse, and went for his daily ride. That night, as Lacey crawled into his own bed, he knew that down the hallway, his mom was already in bed, and that 3 detectives were watching over her room in case a demon appeared. Again, Lacey felt unbelievably embarrassed by this. To even be affiliated with this was just excruciating, but he managed to close his eyes and go to sleep. But, like normal, at some point in the middle of the night, he woke up because his mother was screaming. And Lacey, he's like, oh my gosh, this is so embarrassing. It's only getting worse. But he got out of bed, he went into the hallway, and he began walking down towards where his mother was, where she was screaming inside of the Baron's bedroom, expecting that, once again, the room would be empty and the police would see, this is just complete delusion here. There's no demon, there's no problem. However, when Lacey got to the doorway and looked inside, he saw one of the detectives running across the room and then tackle something that really did look like a demon to the floor. And then Lacey's mother turned on the light. It would turn out that even though Lacey fully expected to inherit his father's title, he was actually not the Baron's firstborn son. Before the Baron had met the Baroness, Lacey's mother, he'd had a relationship with a local peasant woman, and they had had a son together. And the Baron had given that peasant woman a plot of land on the edge of the estate to raise their son in secret. And then the Baron had basically abandoned them both. He had given them the opportunity to, work on the estate and sort of make a living for themselves, but functionally, he didn't interact with them at all. He didn't recognize them at all. They were on their own. Now, the peasant woman, the mother of this child, had sort of accepted that this was their reality, but the secret son had sort of buried that feeling forever until Lacey rode his horse through the gardens despite being told not to and destroyed those flower beds. Because the secret son was that field worker. His job was looking out for the gardens, and it just felt like a step too far. And so the secret son, the field worker, decided he was going to teach this family a lesson. He was going to kill the Baron and the Baroness by scaring them to death. That was his plan. And it sort of worked. He went into the castle and pretended to be a demon in the middle of the night, and he scared the father, the Baron, so badly, he literally had a heart attack and died. However, the secret son continued pretending to be a demon around the Baroness after killing the Baron, and the Baroness would get really, really scared and would scream and claim there's a demon in here. But she didn't die from this. She did not have a heart attack. And so ultimately, the plan was foiled. And so in the end, there was no demon. It was just Lacey's half-brother wrapped in a cloak, wearing a horrifying mask. One morning in early August of 1927, a 24-year-old woman named Inez Perry walked in the back door of the farmhouse where her parents lived in rural Vermont. And as soon as she walked in, she went into the kitchen where her father was at the kitchen table with a man she had never seen before, and the two were shaking hands, and she heard her father say, "We have a deal." And then right after that, Inez's father looked over and saw her, and he explained that this man's name was Clarence Sinclair, and that he and Clarence had just agreed to swap houses. And for a second, Inez was confused, but then it all clicked into place. So Inez's parents had raised her and her other 3 siblings in this farmhouse, but Inez and her siblings had all moved away, and her parents were getting older. Her dad's health in particular was starting to fail, and keeping up the farmhouse was getting to be too much for him. And so her father had been trying to sell the property for a while, but nobody seemed to want it. However, now it seemed like he had finally found a solution. Her dad explained to her that Clarence and his family would move into this farmhouse and take over the farm. And in exchange, he and Inez's mom would move into Clarence's house just a few towns over. Now, to Inez, this arrangement did seem a little strange, but it also did solve her parents' problem. And so even though she was going to be sad to say goodbye to her childhood home, she decided that this had to be the right move for her parents. And so she said, "That's great." A few weeks later, Inez was inside of her parents' new house, helping to get them settled in and organize their living room, when she heard the clattering sound of a horse-drawn wagon coming down the street and coming to a stop right outside. So she walked to the door and she opened it up, but the second she saw who it was that was getting out of the carriage, she slammed the door and locked it. Because the person getting out of that carriage was Clarence Sinclair, the man who Inez's dad had swapped homes with. And the home swap had not gone how Inez and her family had hoped. Inez's parents were thrilled with their new house, so everything on their side was good. But pretty much immediately after actually doing the swap, Clarence had started acting totally unhinged. He had come back to his old home repeatedly without being invited, and he would beg Inez's dad to switch houses back, that he had made a horrible mistake. But Clarence would never elaborate. He would never really explain why he felt this way. He would just, demand, "Please, I've made a horrible mistake. We have to switch back." But Inez's dad had said no. A deal was a deal, and he just had too many health issues to live at that farmhouse anymore. And Clarence couldn't actually cite any real problems with the farmhouse that he so desperately wanted to, give back. And so as far as Inez's dad was concerned, the subject here was closed. He had not given him a faulty property, and there was no real reason here to go back to the way it was, and so it was a no. So now Inez and her parents watched from the window as Clarence hopped out of his wagon and came rushing onto the porch. And he looked absolutely crazy. His hair was messed up and greasy, and there were dark circles under his eyes, and he really looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. And Clarence promptly began pounding on the front door, shouting that his family could not live in their farmhouse, and that this was now a matter of life and death. But eventually, when Inez and her family refused to come out, Clarence finally gave up, turned around, got in his wagon, and drove away. Now, that was the last time that Clarence came to their house. But it was not the last time that Inez and her family would hear about their old farmhouse. A few weeks later, on November 4th, after several days of very heavy rainfall, Inez picked up the newspaper and saw that their old neighborhood had been basically washed away by historic flooding, and that included their old farmhouse. It had literally been carried off, and the family that had been living in the farmhouse were dead. But that family was not Clarence Sinclair's family. It would turn out that after Clarence and his family had moved into said farmhouse, Clarence began having these horrible dreams where his dead mother would appear to him and tell him to move out of this farmhouse right now because something terrible is going to happen here. Now, at first, Clarence ignored this and chalked it up to a bad dream, but the dream kept happening over and over and over again, and it was driving him mad. And so eventually, he did go to Inez and Inez's parents and tried to switch it back because he felt like this dream really meant something. But Inez's father just kept saying no and said, "No, that's your house now." And so Clarence never elaborated to the family about why he wanted this back because it made no sense to him either, but he ultimately listened to his dead mother in his dream, and he wound up just selling the farmhouse just to not live there anymore. And so that decision would ultimately save Clarence and his family. But it would also condemn to death the family who moved in.